saying I'm not going to do any magic until I understand everything that's involved means you will never do magic. It's as simple as that. You might have ridiculous reasons for starting your career as a magician. And it doesn't matter, because whatever your reasons are, they're probably not the real reason. And you will find better explanations for why you got into it in the first place a bit further down the track.
Today on the Glitch Bottle podcast, Banishing the Armchair, and so many more magical topics with return guest, magician, author, scholar, and grimoiric firebrand, Mr. Jake Stratton-Kent. Salutations, listeners, and welcome to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today on the podcast, Mr. Jake Stratton-Kent indeed returns to help us uncover a trove of magical advice, practical guidance, and observations. But a quick disclaimer to you, if you have not heard Jake's previous appearance on this podcast, please make sure to check that out. It's episode number 6, and I'll make sure to put a link in the description of this video. And in that previous episode, Jake touches on several important topics, including his take on the actual roots of goetic magic, what most magicians get wrong while approaching magic, and where he thinks magic in the 21st century is going. We also discuss the Grimoirium Verum and what this term mage-splaining is all about, so I definitely think you'll enjoy that episode. And in this episode, so many magical diamonds are pulled out of the rough. Jake shares his thoughts on the proto-Grimorium Verum text, the Ars Rabidmadar, which Joseph Peterson is currently working on. Jake says that he doesn't do angels, so in this podcast, you'll see exactly what he means by that. And we also explore the concepts of thwarting angels. Jake shares his view on ritual offerings and the real importance of the first planetary hour of each planetary day. Jake also talks about his online forum, Attendance of Adrastia. He shares his thoughts on Cunningman Magic versus ritual magic, and even drops some hints on what he might be working on with future projects. All this and so much more, and now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Mr. Jake Stratton-Kent. Jake Stratton-Kent, thank you so much for coming back on the Glitch Bottle podcast. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's good to be here, Alexander.
We were just talking before the interview about Joseph Peterson's work he's doing on a translation of the Ars Rabidmadar text from Latin, and how this is pretty exciting because it's a proto-Grimorium Verum text, and obviously you have very, very deep knowledge on the Grimorium Verum practically and from a scholarly perspective. What is this Ars Rabidmadar text, and why is it so important and different from other grimoires out there?
I'm not going to try and beat Joe to the punch, because Joseph Peterson is my favourite grimoirist by a long chalk. He does wonderful work. And yet, a few years ago, nobody had heard of this text. We thought that Wellcome and Lansdowne manuscripts were the proto-Grimorium Verum, and they're only a few years different from the first printed edition. But my intuition was that the Grimorium Verum is actually much older, and Joseph's research has more than borne this out. Ars Rabidmadar is 1600 thereabouts, and has many, many of the most interesting features of the Grimorium Verum within it. Now, it shows that it's not a sensationalized 18th century text at all. It's from a definite, strong, and important strand of Solomonic magic. And basically, I can't wait to see Joseph's work in print on this. It's a major landmark on my horizon.
I remember hearing about that, Jake, a lot when it came to the Grimorium Verum, that, this is one of the later texts, and it's overly dark on purpose, and it's trying to be more ominous than other texts that are earlier. I mean, why do you think when it comes to the Grimorium Verum that there was all of this, mythos is too strong a word, but all of these misconceptions about the actual text?
Well, it's rather reminiscent of Mather's missing out bits of some manuscripts, because they were from the Grimorium Verum, and that's black magic, and Solomonic is all high magic, which is an obvious nonsense. I mean, Solomonic magic is magic, and magic it's amoral. The Grimorium Verum is obviously representative of an authentic strand, and A weight and so forth to the contrary. It's not sensationalized. It comes from a different end of the spectrum. And a very interesting and surprisingly modern one. I mean, for instance, the instructions for female operants are also found in this 1600s manuscript. They're not a late development either. And that contrasts strongly with Abramelin saying, well, yes, women can do magic, but I'd rather they didn't. The Grimoire Verum, or its prototype, just assumes they do, and where the instrument is necessary to make differences from male practitioners, it's there, with no moral content whatsoever. Just simple. I mean, you want to do it, here you go. It's virtually on the first page as well. I mean, it really is remarkable.
Do you think, Jake, that with work like on the Ars Rabidmadar and other texts, that all of these are pointing to some kind of mother texts, so to speak, or do you think that this is just merely influences upon texts and they kind of build off one another?
I have built-in aversion to the idea of an text. I think variety, rich variety, is what distinguishes a living tradition. And you can't get all the variants to agree. Eventually, you have to choose one or the other and just be coherent and consistent within it, which is a pretty tough job, without being ignorant of the other strands. I stick with the Grimoirium Verum pretty much as is in practical work. Those are operating parameters, and they're quite clear-cut for the most part. There are interesting loose ends as well, which is another subject entirely.
To that point, Jake, we had Aaron Leach on the podcast talking about, and I've spoken with Frater Chiasson about this, and Dr. Skinner, talking about this concept of thwarting angels and using thwarting angels versus a kind of chain of command approach. And I know that you've touched on both of these in your own online forums and your own writings, but just for the listeners, Jake, can you kind of talk to us about how do you see the definition of using thwarting angels versus like what is the chain of command approach and why are they different? What would you like listeners to know about that?
There's other questions lining up which touch on a similar area, so I might as well start there. Thwarting angels aren't a master key to ceremonial magic for a start, so putting them in first place is a bit redundant. However, in the invocation or conjuration phase of ritual tech, which is fairly uniform, there is a variation right there. The intermediary can take, generalizing, one of two forms. One of them is the angelic vice-regent, who is like God's right-hand man and in charge of all of the angels, who in turn are in charge of all of the demons and the whole of creation. He's marshal of the hosts of heaven, etc., etc. And the thwarting angels belongs to that aspect of the intermediary concept. But the other aspect is the trickster. In mythology, both of these types are what makes interaction between gods and men, and in fact, between gods and gods even possible. There's no story without the intermediary figure. But yes, it could take either the angelic vice-regent type or the trickster type. Occasionally, the trickster is a marshal of the hosts of heaven as well. For instance, Monkey in Greek mythology, they're very much a trickster, but also marshal of the hosts of heaven, not an angelic vice-regent. Then you get Eshu and Elegua and so on. Again, often have the marshal of the hosts aspect and the trickster aspect. But yes, this intermediary can take either form or a combination of both. The thwarting angels paradigm only fits with the angelic vice-regent aspect of this principle. The chain of command, which you find in the older Greco-Egyptian texts, where simply every god has his demigods and daemons and so on under him, and when you perform an invocation of the god, you'll also get their train turning up. The first to arrive will be daemons of that type and so on. This is found in classical literature like Plutarch and so on, again and again. It's not a foreign body to Western thought. Basically, Apollo or whatever god has lower beings under him, and that's a chain of command. And you can work with Apollo in order to work with his demons. It's quite simple. there's nothing complicated about it. I mean, magicians love their tables. This chain of command is usually set out in one.
Do you think that people who write extensively about, for example, Dr. Skinner writing about Dr. Thomas Rudd, who obviously took the Shemham Farash angels and used them in his goetic approach and combined that with elements of the Heptameron? I remember talking to Dr. Skinner about that, and every time we talked about thwarting angels and how people might say, well, Rudd might have invented this, Dr. Skinner immediately goes back to the history and says, well, thwarting angels were present in the Testament of Solomon, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Yeah.
Absolutely they are. Yeah. I'm not saying it's inauthentic. I'm saying it's not compulsory and it's not the only option.
I think this is something that Aaron Leach really complimented you on, about how in your writings you talk about these kind of two different strands that are running through the grimoires. There's this kind of, Christian heavy command, demanding approach. And then there's the approach that really goes back to the goetic roots of respecting the spirits, engaging with them, building relationships. Is the thwarting angels versus the chain of command approach, is that kind of related to those two strands that you mentioned that can flow through the grimoires?
Yeah. Although it's too easy to say that one is nice to spirits and the other is nasty. I think all magicians in the ancient world appreciated that some spirits were pretty bloody nasty. Opening yourself up to all of them, probably not the way to go. The chain of command offers just as many safeguards against possibly hostile spirits. But yes, forming a relationship at the same time is absolutely what it's about. Perhaps you need to make your connections higher up the chain of command in order to be on the safe side, and don't expect all spirits to say, oh, you're a pagan, welcome aboard. That's not how it works.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not saying only fluffy bunnies need a fly, because that's not it.
That is probably the best quote that I have heard so far this year. That is fantastic. That's right up there when you talk about dark fluff and other trends in the magical community.
Thank you.
Yes.
I appreciate it.
No, that is fantastic. And in fact, this kind of leads to a few listener questions, Jake. One of the listeners has a few questions. He talked about the approach of evocation. And if you were to call for and evoke a spirit you are very familiar with in a public area, the question is, would anyone notice it, or is it all quote unquote in your mind? So I know that obviously isolation is something that you talk about with magical engagements, but for the person who does decide to approach it that way, Jake, any thoughts on that in terms of people noticing any phenomena?
Most models will get some results, whether they're right or wrong, from the simple fact that you're doing something, whether your explanation is up to par or not. Yeah, psychological explanation, it's okay if it gets you up and doing things. A hook, line and sinker belief approach, well, maybe that will also get places, but there's problems. I went to a spiritualist church once, an anecdote here, and there was a medium going around saying, I see geraniums, does geraniums mean anything to anybody? And people were all saying, yeah, my grandmother had geraniums. And I was like, this is a bit weird, and I was a bit upfront and faith in the Lord, Felomite Golden Dawn magician at the time, so I thought, I don't want a reading me and talking about flowers. So I surrounded myself with an akashic egg, as you do in the lesser ritual of the pentagram and so forth. And suddenly she was, I see an oval. Well, that's interesting. that's very interesting. Yeah. So yeah, people will occasionally pick up on the fact that you're doing something, whether it's all in the mind or whatever. Well, yeah, it's going to be in their mind too, possibly. Or maybe it isn't all in the mind at all. Maybe it's an objective phenomena. Either explanation works, and still, you can influence other people at a distance. Yeah.
Do you, Jake, also in your extensive experience see what Dr. Skinner's talking about in terms of the nature, almost like these entities are not animalistic, but they have some of the tendencies. They don't like traffic noise. They like to be away from everything. Is it similar in your experience?
Well, yeah, those working conditions are useful, maybe not indispensable, but they certainly make things a great deal easier. It's difficult to arrange them all the time, but obviously if you can form a pact under ideal conditions, you don't need the ideal conditions so much in your later relations with the spirit. Where I'm at variance with Dr. Skinner is the assumption that these are all the lesser, quite stupid beings talked about by Iamblichus. Yeah, they can be wild and ferocious and not very friendly, although on the other hand, you can get on with them perfectly well, with others perfectly well. But I don't think they're stupid and easily led is particularly accurate. Although I can get his reference to Iamblichus. We're certainly talking about part of the spirit hierarchy that he described, but I don't think it's an adequate explanation of all the phenomena you get when dealing with spirits out of the grimoires.
I would like to talk about some of those differences because, for instance, Dr. Skinner writes a lot about how a lot of the items in a ceremonial operation, the crown, the sword, the robes, these are done not for the magician's benefit, but to impress the spirits so that, according to Dr. Skinner, when you're engaging in an evocation, the spirit isn't quite sure if you're King Solomon or not. And these threats that are made, obviously the mage has no actual power to force a spirit into the burning fires of hell for all eternity. But if someone threatens that way, all of a sudden the spirit, as you said, according to the Iamblichus definition, isn't sure, so it's going to do what you want anyway if you bind it properly. Can you just comment on that in terms of our spirits, to Dr. Skinner's point, are they impressed or even fooled by this kind of regalia and approach and pre-consecrated items and any of that?
Well, there are references to exactly these practices in, I can't remember which particular Greek playwright, but yes, there's a satirical passage where a magician is dressing up with the skin of Hercules and various other bits and pieces from other people who've been to hell and come back. And yeah, that is authentic. But on the other hand, when a magician in the PGM says, I am Osiris, or I can do this, or I can do that, are they building themselves up as much as they are trying to, quote-unquote, fool the spirit? Identifying yourself with a god or with a hero, yes, it could be just as much about its effect on the magician as on the spirit. And why shouldn't it, in fact, be a bit of both?
I think listeners will really appreciate that answer, Jake. And that leads to another question from the same listener who said, talking about the goetic operation of the Lemegeton, asking, quote, what exactly is the magician doing to the demon or the chthonic entity when you, for instance, place its seal in a black box with brimstones and hold it above coals? Is it experiencing actual pain, or is it more symbolic? Will it seek vengeance in the afterlife? I mean, what are your thoughts on that in terms of when you actually do start threatening and actually allegedly causing some kind of physical pain for the spirit?
Well, my answer is necessarily partly hypothetical in that isn't the operating system that I work with. My working parameters are rather different. And the stages of procedure that Stephen Skinner outlines are actually identical across quite a wide spectrum of how spirits are seen and how they are dealt with. The structure is key, but it's not limited to just one section of the spectrum. I don't have a box to put the spirit sigil in. I very rarely take a sword into the circle with me, although I'm fairly proficient with such items. My methodology is different. I don't assume the spirit's hostility from the word go. I take steps in case it should be the case.
To that point, Jake, one of the other questions from this listener is, when the spirit does make its appearance in an operation, the magician is then tasked with giving it challenges to prove itself. So to that point, Jake, when you're engaging with spirits, maybe even for the first time, although you have obviously decades of experience, in your earlier days, to prove a spirit's identity, how do you actually go about testing the spirit? There's all kinds of different tests and questions in the grimoires, but how do you test the spirit? Do you make it take an oath, or do you challenge it with using, as you say, chain of command approaches, with threatening it with its superiors, so to speak? Or how do you make sure that spirit is who it says it is?
Well, there's very little need to threaten the spirit. the names of its superiors, if you've successfully invoked them first. My approach tends to place the chiefs under deities, and then there's the deputies under the chiefs and subordinates below them. And often, in the past, as you say, I've begun with an invocation of the appropriate deity. So I've usually found no problem with this methodology. Crowley actually discusses this versus the more general Grimoire process in Book 4, and it's an interesting discussion. And he said that this divine invocation method is actually simpler and less demanding. I mean, it's still demanding, but it's simpler and more straightforward than the usual Grimoire process. But there are nonetheless traces of it in Grimoire processes. So, yeah, I found very little need for disobedience. I'm getting off the track here. getting off the track here, sorry.
In fact, Jake, that leads to a question that when Aaron Leach was on the podcast, he mentioned that when it came to the Lemegeton's Goetia and different ways to approach things, that he referenced using two inscriptions of the Spirit Seal, one to be placed in the Triangle of Art to effectively have a place for the Spirit to live in, and the other to be worn as a pentacle of protection. And I wanted to get your take on this, and I actually did speak with Aaron a few hours ago, and he kind of added onto this point saying, the Goetia does tell you to make the seal of the Spirit out of the proper metal. Then it says absolutely nothing about what to do with it or where to put it. If you were just using the talisman to summon the spirit for a conversation, you could leave it on the altar, but even then it's going to be touched and in some sense inhabited by that spirit merely via the process of the evocation itself. However, if you want to use, say, a brass vessel, then the talisman becomes the sacred object inside the vessel. And Aaron's point is, why wouldn't you place it there for the evocation? And Aaron ends by saying, I think perhaps my view, while not specifically instructed in the text, is pretty much common sense. Just look at how the veves are used in voodoo. You inscribe them on the ground as the gateway through which the Loa are called, and talismans and their sigils are the same. So I guess, Jay, given all of that, what are your thoughts about that in terms of placing the, spirit's sigil inside a triangle of evocation? And can you just kind of comment on all of this stuff?
Again, now there's a strong contrast with my working parameters. The triangle is not universal throughout the grimoires, and in particular, it's not even present in the Grimorium Verum. Whereas wearing a sigil is present, very much present. This takes us back to the initial instructions to male and female operators. It isn't the sigil of the particular spirit that's worn, it's the spirit of the particular chief. And it's worn for a period of time before the ritual is even undertaken. Once you've got so far with the preparation stage and so on, and you're preparing to get to the nitty-gritty of evocation itself, you can make virgin parchments and all the rest of it because you've got all the tools. That's when you make this pentacle to wear that has the sigil of the appropriate chief over the deputy who is over the spirit that you want to talk to. So there's quite a difference of emphasis there, but also some similarities, as you can see. No sign of the triangle. The Grimorium Verum, it talks about becoming a familiar intimate of the particular superior spirits that you want to work through. A familiar intimate isn't a potential enemy. Absolutely. In fact, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just doing this by memory, but I believe Dr. Skinner mentions in Techniques of Solomonic Magic that he found no evidence of a floor triangle pre, 1500s, that there's no evidence in the Byzantine texts for a floor triangle, so that does seem like a newer development. Yeah, it's a line, a strand. It's not core. It's assumed to be because of the massive influence of the Mavis Crowley Goetia on the early and more recent revival. Where the Goetia has to follow these lines. No, that's a strand of Goetia tradition, and a fairly recent one. All the manuscripts of the Goetia of Solomon are in English and early modern. Whereas there's other strands which you find in the Grimorium Verum, which you can trace in the Hygromantia and really early source texts like that, including female spirits, for example. That's the Sibylline strand. We know is ancient, goes back to Byzantine times. And yet A. Waite and very recent commentators say, this is just a bit of flim-flammery that the sensationalist grimoires introduced. Wrong. wrong. There's variation quite a way back, and this gives us precedence for doing things differently. I'm not saying older is better, I'm just saying there are more precedents for more ways of working than the occult revival currently envisages to a large extent. We've got a very stereotyped idea about this is how Goetia is done, anything else is heretical. No, everything else is actually quite a bit older and generally pretty authentic.
Absolutely. And I think that's definitely what listeners and readers love about your work, is that you trace the, incredibly deep historical roots of Goetic practice, and you actually show not only the evolution to where we get the grimoires, but also the different strains. And to that point, a listener actually, Jake, just texted me saying, I have a random question for Jake, and this one is, according to the listener, a bit spicy. The listener says, there are some magicians who claim physical manifestation with no ritual tools or preparation, not even using those. Is that possible, or are they deluded?
Well, I think there's a great deal of delusion about the whole idea of physical manifestation, and it's been taught to death ever since Joseph Liszewski started hammering the table with his shoe on the subject. How do you know it's physical when you're in a circle and it's in a triangle? I mean, is there some kind of game of ping pong going on here to establish that it's not just visual, it's actually physical? And does it bloody matter? How often really is so-called physical manifestation, footprints in the dirt outside the circle, like in Night of the Demon, how often is that really tied to getting a result out of your ritual?
Dr. Skinner mentioned that, for example, when the grimoires mention, auditory and visual presence, that it is one of those true signs. I think he mentioned, for instance, an audio presence is where you hear a voice. It's not a physical voice, but you absolutely 100% can tell it's not your voice, or it's not a thought in your head. So there's this clear delineation where you're like, I actually have something here. Have you felt, or have you experienced in your practical magical works a similar thing when it comes to that, or is it just different?
I think there's a legit point here, but it's occasionally overstated. I mean, we have the alternative methodology of scrying, in which you might get a very strong visual impression of the spirit, in accordance with the various forms of the spirit laid down in the Heptameron, for instance. You start seeing the appropriate visions of coloured garments or trees, or even such and such a king riding a dragon. But it's happening within the crystal. I mean, you could say, well, the crystal is a physical object, so this is physical manifestation of a kind. But yeah, it's of a kind is the crucial bit there. Yeah, getting back to your earlier question about authority, I mean, there's a fairly stereotyped way of doing this, which has some value. The word conjure means to swear together. So if you're a true believer in the Bible, for instance, getting the spirit to say, yep, the Bible is authoritative and true, and to swear by the divine names in it, etc., makes a great deal of sense. But if you were a Thelemite, for instance, you might greet the spirit with, do what thou wilt to be the whole of the law, and wait for a positive response. And the Thelemite magician would know what those are. And if the spirit says, well, yeah, I can work within those parameters, love is the law, love unto will, or makes an 11-fold knock, which is clearly audible, well, then you've made the agreement within those particular religious or magico-religious parameters. Yeah, you've got its word, you've agreed by something which you also agree with.
Absolutely, Jake. And in fact, that touches on one of the main components of at least ceremonial magic in Europe when one thinks of the Goetia, the Lemegeton, the Key of Solomon, which is the Liber Spiritum, the Book of Spirits. And some authors like Dr. Skinner mention, placing the Book of Spirits in the triangle itself and being a place either for a physical imprint of the spirit to document some kind of oath being consummated or bound, or just having the spirit's sigil up there. Do you, Jake, in your work, use a Liber Spiritum as part of your practical work or as part of ceremonial magical work, or is that not something that you tend to have present?
There's strong analogues, and I've discussed this in print, between the pact process and the Liber Spirituum process. So they both involve the formulation of the document, involving the sigil and the invocations used, etc., on a page. Now, the pact is like one page, the book is a collection of pages, but otherwise the process is very, very similar and fits into the framework or tech which Stephen Skinner delineates. But you have to be aware it can go either way without breaking the pattern. The Grimoire and Verum is a pact-making process. Sigils are enormously important in it, so yes, a document is formulated with the sigil of spirit on it, and an offering of incense is burnt to the pact. In greeting the spirit, I burn this incense in the name of and to the honour of the spirit or spirits named on that pact, which you are holding in your hand with the wand of invocation in the other. So, yeah, the process of pact making and the use of the Liber Spirituum follow very, very similar principles. I just happen to go with the pact option.
Absolutely. And to that point, Jake, Dr. Skinner mentions that to him, the essence of offerings, he mentioned this in the podcast, is to literally offer it to the spirit. If you physically offer something, if you physically offer something to a spirit, then the spirit is able to access it, whether it be the appropriate incense or, fire, whatever it is. How do you see spiritual offerings and the efficacy and affecting the efficacy of ceremonial magic?
I'm very much on the same page as Stephen here. Yeah, as I say, in the Grimoire and Verum process, every spirit is greeted with an offering of frankincense. This is the polite, just getting to know you, first steps offering. You might sensibly ask the spirit if there are other things, particular to them rather than spirits in general, which they might prefer on a future occasion. And I have found throughout the Grimoire and Verum hierarchy, an offering of fire, even if it's only a big stubby red candle, but preferably like going outside, a fire is an expected offering. And obviously that's more or less present in the offering of frankincense, but you'd be well advised to take it a bit further. But yeah, other spirits might have quite unique likes and dislikes. Some of them might say, never mind the frankincense next time, let's have some sandalwood. Others, particularly if they're being asked to do something, might ask for, in my experience, eggs, barley flour, occasionally blood, but that's much, much rarer than a lot of people assume. It would be no surprise if some of the spirits had likes which other spirits absolutely abominated. You find this in Kimbanda and other traditions. There's a particular important spirit who cannot abide water, whereas almost all the others would like a glass of clear, refreshing water as part of an offering. But so, yeah, there is variety, and you'd be well advised to ask the spirit after the polite frankincense introduction.
Absolutely. And to that point, Jake, something that Dr. Skinner and Aaron Leach have touched on is it only when you offer that to the spirit, whether it be, as you say, frankincense or even in rare instances, a blood offering or water, no matter what it is, only when you offer it, is that when the spirit is able to access it and actually, use it or appreciate it as an offering? But if you don't offer it, it's just kind of not effective. It just kind of sits there.
Well, yeah, the Grimoire and Verum is very clear about that. This kind of creature does nothing for nothing. It might sound a little bit scary, but it also makes a great deal of sense. The offering isn't your soul, of course, but the appropriate incentives, foods, drinks, or even experiences. I think a particular part of my hierarchy likes a process I call a night in with the boys, where there's a lot of noise, loud music, drink, smoke, swearing, stamping. Other spirits aren't so keen on this. It's only really appropriate to a particular bracket of them, and it's much closer to some New World traditions than it is what most people understand as Goetia, but it's evolved from my relationships with particular spirits. Fairly simple process, or they can give you a bit of a hangover that they are. So yeah, offering is a complicated business.
When it comes to that point and the whole, as Dr. Skinner says, the carrot and the stick approach to evocation and to manifesting a spirit, do you find that there is a balance between kind of a carrot, or as you say, the offerings, the benedictions, the welcoming of the spirits, no matter what they prefer, you are welcoming them. You are giving them a place that's hospitable versus the actual kind of formal display of authority. Maybe not threats, but maybe just saying that you are identified with some kind of deity. Do you find that in your experience, is the carrot and the stick mentality or balance, is it 50-50? Is it 80-20? Can you kind of share with us about your own experience between the soft power, let's say, and actually, have there been times when you've had to say, look, I'm going to display my own authority as a magician for maybe spirits that are a little bit more tricksy or troublesome?
It might depend a fair amount on the operator. I mean, you can imagine some sort of shy, retiring, self-effacing curate who happens to perform Solomonic magic needing to really stress how authoritative and scary and potentially dangerous he was when, in real life he wasn't particularly. Yeah, I'm from the other end of things, My mother occasionally finds pictures of me scary. That's just a photo. People frequently find me scary, so I might be blissfully unaware of the fact that the spirits say, well, yeah, Jake's not to be messed with quite a lot of the time. And we just get on with each other. One of the first meetings with a Verum spirit I ever had was with the spirit Frimost, who is a pretty dangerous character. I mean, his sigil is one of those that's used fairly frequently in the nastier spells of the process. So, we know he can be a badass. But he didn't come over as a threatening, dangerous guy waving his arms about and spitting fire at me. He was very, very calm and composed, don't you? Obviously so strong he didn't have to make a big display out of it. I literally saw him leaning on a post at the place I was working in with his arms crossed on his chest, a bit like a doorman, but he looked very relaxed, not bothered at all. That was my takeaway from there. It's strength and authority come in different forms. A big display isn't strictly necessary if you've actually got it.
Right, absolutely. In fact, this goes to a listener question. We were talking about this right before the interview, and you touched on this. A question for Jake is, who exactly dubbed you Britain's most notorious necromancer? Because, to me, that is pretty badass. End quote. Can you comment on this, Jake?
That would be the equally notorious Peter and Kika of Scarlet Imprint. Either one or both of them came up with that. It's fun. It's fun being Britain's most notorious necromancer, but there's not a lot of competition, so perhaps it's easier than it sounds.
This kind of leads, Jake, to something we were talking about right before the interview, which is one of the listeners on the Glitch Bottle YouTube channel mentioned that they noticed, to them, Solomonic magic is so broad that there's 3 different kind of takes or strains on this. On the one hand, you have, according to the listener, Aaron Leach, who's very much into building relationships with spirits, approaching and writing about it from a shamanistic perspective, Western shamanism, and talking about, the influences throughout, the shamanistic influences throughout time. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have, say, Dr. Stephen Skinner, who it's very much about getting the tech down, the steps of evocation, about using the proper consecrations, about saying that belief, as Dr. Skinner says, really isn't necessary, that you technically could be an atheist and execute the results of an operation and get results. That's on his side of the spectrum. And then you have Jake Stratton-Kent, who, with his deep knowledge of the Goetia and taking a look at the historical roots, goes in a completely different direction. Can you, Jake, just kind of share your thoughts on, do you also see these different strains under the giant Solomonic umbrella, or where does all that fall for you?
Well, but there are different strands within the historical tradition, for a start. But yeah, in modern times, you could be fooled into thinking that there's 2 camps, but in fact, I've been having this self-same thought. There are at least 3. And so they've all got points of overlap, but also points of difference. And I'm particularly looking forward to seeing Julio's work, Magister Officiorum, where he kind of bears out some of what I've been saying about we need to look outside the Anglophone world to really get a grip on what Goetia is about. We need to be able to learn from the New World traditions, as well as not wanting to change everything in the grimoires at the same time. So we've got a form of purism that is actually more open-ended than it sounds, contrasting with other forms of purism. And you've got my end of things, which is very appreciative and respectful of the New World traditions. But I come from England, for God's sake, where there wasn't even voodoo available, let alone Kimbanda back in the 1970s. So yeah, it's a pretty broad church, modern Goetia, and trying to divide it into black and white, just two opposing schools, would be massively oversimplifying things. I have sympathy for various modern strands. I deeply respect Stephen Skinner. I love Joseph Peterson's work. I'm a bit iffy about Joseph Liszewski's style, and he's the guy who started off grimoire purism without actually being a grimoire purist. There are definitely more than two strands, and I think Julio's work is going to exemplify that. You need to be in it to know what some of the strands are, but being too committed to one can blind you to the virtues of another. It's a good idea to keep an open mind and keep abreast of all the major developments in your field, by whether you're 100% in sympathy with that author or not.
Absolutely. And I think listeners will definitely be looking forward to that future work, as well as, continuing to follow the discussions that happen almost daily as well on your own Facebook page, which I'd love to talk about, your Attendance of Adrastrea page that really Yes.
Attendance of Adrastea.
Yes, thank you. The Attendance of Adrastea. I warned you, Jake, that my Greek is totally not up to speed. So
mine either.
Well, yes, thank you, sir. The Attendance of Adrastea page. Can you just tell us a little bit about why you created this Facebook page that is not only based on your writings, but kind of opens up an additional space online for specific discussions regarding the ancient Goetic tradition up to the present. Can you just kind of share a little bit about the genesis of this idea?
It helps dissipate the idea that I'm some kind of grimoire purist, or that I fit neatly into the Solomonic bracket for a start. And that was necessary and useful. Attendance is more open to discussing affinities between traditions, historical or contemporary, that bear on matters Goetic. Without claiming there's any absolute equivalence, but we can talk about them. The point of view of my works is like the launch pad, the starting point for those discussions, so we don't have to go into discussions which are being had perfectly adequately elsewhere. We can be more focused, but also more relaxed.
A listener does have a question of, this topic gets brought up often. I'd love Jake's perspective. I want to know if Jake memorizes all of the conjurations used in his work. Can you just talk about this issue of memorization? And we touched on this last time, but I know that Dr. Skinner mentioned that, look, it's way better to memorize as opposed to fumbling around with a script in the dim candlelight. Can you just kind of touch on this?
I get his point. On the other hand, W.G. Gray talks about this on occasion. It's a good idea to have a script, even if you have it memorized, because under the psycho-spiritual pressures of the actual event, you might stumble. It's good to have a prompt available, and I have some sympathy with that. I have in the past performed a ritual which I had very well memorized, done it dozens of times, if not hundreds of times, where I threw the pages of the script over my shoulder as I went through them, and many of those pages I haven't even looked at. I had it there, and I built it into the physical actions of the ritual, throwing the pages away. But I have various prayers very well memorized. What I call the prayer for success, which is a Solomonic form, but totally identical processes occur in the papyri, which I have very well memorized. I say it at least twice a day, at some occasions dozens of times a day, for years. I've had the relevant parts of Liber Pyramidos memorized at various times, but it's still quite a good idea to have a script available for various reasons. I mean, the book, it is a power object, so a script kind of fits the bill of what magicians are up to with their various connections with writing and so on, in the language of spells, grammar, and so on. So yes and no, memorize it, but it might be a bit hubristic to think you are never ever going to falter under the pressures of a conjuration ritual.
That is such valuable advice, and I'd love to get your take on this, because that touches on what Dr. Skinner brought up about psychological tension versus magical tension. And he mentioned that there's psychological tension in anything. If you're baking a cake, there's psychological tension. If you're playing a sport, there's psychological tension. But he also mentioned that magical tension is when you are pulling via the conjurations and via the ceremony. You are pulling an unwilling spirit, or a spirit that might be at least a little bit hesitant, into the ritual space. And building of this magical tension can take place over even hours if it's your first attempt at some evocations. Jake, what are your thoughts on magical tension? Do you also see that as something that needs to be built? Is it something where you are like pulling, quote unquote, a spirit into the ritual space? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I certainly recognize the experience he's referring to, yeah. Yeah, magic is more or less automatic, regardless of belief, or at least that's how this form of magic was conceived in the Middle Ages. But just the same, it's not like pushing a button. You become aware, increasingly aware of the spirit's approach. And this is also partly why I'm not totally down with the physical manifestation thing, because it might approach by walking through a wall, which suggests that it's not entirely physical in the sense we understand. But yeah, it's very much arriving. But yeah, there is that magical tension, and it is different and distinct from mere anticipation, like butterflies before giving a talk, which incidentally I don't suffer from.
Dr. Skinner mentioned one of the worst things that can happen in a ceremonial operation is the spirit arrives, but it doesn't give any sign of its arrival, which might be one of the worst things, because you don't really know what to do. Can you comment on that in terms of a spirit arriving but just not giving any signs?
Yeah, and this is where the repetition thing comes in, repeating the conjuration, because you can't see the spirit, but that doesn't mean it's not there. And I've had, anecdote time again, I've had a pair of psychics with me in some of the bigger conjurations I've done, and I've been like getting into the cycle of repetition, and one of the psychics has said, "Oh no, he's actually here." Shut up now.
Especially someone of your caliber, I think listeners will really appreciate that. Aaron Leach in the last podcast mentioned a lot about ritual offerings, and he kind of said that, when it comes to offerings, obviously it's incredibly important for building relationships with spirits, and that even if you don't know all the attributes of a spirit, just offering generic things like having, water, liquor, honey, for example, or incense that's appropriate to the spirit can give people a pretty good start in terms of ritual offerings. I guess the question, Jake, is from your perspective, do you also engage in ritual offerings on a daily basis? Is this something that is incorporated into your work on the ceremonial end as well? Can you just kind of share a little bit with the listeners about your take on ritual offerings?
But it depends how busy I am versus how lazy I am. I participate in the great giggle as well as the great work. But certain spirits are integral to everything I do. So if I want to maintain the link with all of them, at the very, very least, I have to be making regular offerings to that particular spirit. If I'm busy, there might be quite a lot of others in play getting their regular offering. But if I'm not so busy, it will tend to narrow down to the one spirit who enables me to engage with all the others. That's partly just how I go about things. I'm not saying it's right or wrong or historically authentic or so on, but I seem to be getting away with it. But yeah, I am in favour of offerings to spirits, and I consider every invocation contains such an offering, and your ongoing relations with the spirit, when they're close at least, will also necessitate the making of offerings. The spirit with whom I make my regular contact is known as Skirlin in the Grimoire in Verum. He goes under some other names here and there. And yeah, his offerings are of a fairly high order. He doesn't demand anything physical, whether it's water or even incense or so on, although I can take the offering further and include various things that I know he likes. There could be an offering of mace, for instance, because that's his incense. And I could use other rituals and prayers or make the ritual more formal in order to really get his attention and show how seriously I was taking it. But at the bare minimum, there'll be a simple ritual performed every day, because it is the energy of ritual itself which he says is the most appropriate offering, and the only one he demands.
Oh, that is fascinating, Jay. Can you elaborate on that about the energy of ritual? Does that tie into something that you and Dr. Skinner and Frater Chassan and Aaron, almost everyone I talk to says, look, the number one piece of advice we have, and you've said this in the past, is just do it. You know, you're going to get all kinds of advice, but just jump in and do it. Can you talk about the energy of ritual? That is fascinating. Is it just by doing it every single day or doing it as often as you can, that in and of itself is an offering that's acceptable to the spirits?
Well, to this particular spirit, certainly, and I'm going to slap myself on the wrist for using such a vague and sloppy term as energy in the first place, but yeah, that's done. But yeah, absolutely, one should jump in the deep end and do it, and a lot of one's questions will become redundant if you do. It's pretty much the only way to learn things, is perform the ritual over and over again. Sometimes you can drum yourself into it by saying, sod the planetary hours, I've got to do this every day until it's second nature, whether the planetary hours work fit or not, and that's perfectly legit, in my opinion. Pyramid Arts, for instance, I've worked on a daily basis for months on end in the past. One occasion in my life, I also performed the invocation for us 44 days straight, in order to get something worked out in my head and to apologise for certain errors in my conceptions. So yeah, jumping in and doing it, that is certainly the way to go. The grimoire is a grammar, and repetition is itself a magical technique.
Well, that is very valuable advice, and that leads into another listener question, Jake, about a spirit, obviously, that you just touched on. The listener asks, I would love Jake's take on Skirlin, and supposedly in the grimoire Verum, he's tasked with fetching other spirits. Because this spirit is fairly mysterious and not much is written, what is Jake's take on this spirit? Can you kind of comment on that, Jake?
There's quite a few angles you can approach this from. It's as well to realise that some important spirits have more than one name across the genre, or even in variant manuscripts of the same book. I'm 99.9% certain that Cyrak and Skirlin in Grimoire and Verum are the same spirit. Cyrak is said to rule over 18 spirits, and Skirlin is said to have authority to put you in touch with at least 18 spirits, although it actually goes further. He goes up as well as down in who he can put you in contact with, and this is due to other affinities he has. But let's stick with this particular manuscript's strain. If you compare the Grimoire Verum and the Grand Grimoire with Welcome Manuscript 4669 or Lansdowne 1202, you will find clearly related spirit hierarchies with some differences here and there that may be arbitrary, may be mistakes, but they're basically talking about the same guys. Now, Grimoire Verum, excellent book, gets a lot of things right, but I think it makes a slight fudge of the 6 deputies. And in Welcome Manuscript and Lansdowne Manuscript, you have this important deputy called Cyraki, which is obviously very close to Cyrak. And in the Grand Grimoire's recension of the 6 deputies, its key player in the same position and in the same list is Lucifuge Rothakali. So we can say Cyraki and Lucifuge Rothakali have the same job, and otherwise these lists are freaking identical, so they're the same spirit. He has other names and affinities in other grimoires. I talk about this in Pandemonium quite a bit. There's a spirit named Leonard who turns up in folk magic and elsewhere. You see a picture of Leonard, it's identical to a picture of Lucifuge Rothakali, the 3 horns, all the rest of it. He's the Prince of the Sabbath. Grimoire Verum also focuses on the spirits of the East, so we can assume that Cyraki is quite a big deal in the hierarchy of the East. And you look at the Goetia catalogue and various other catalogues, they also make a big deal out of the king of the East. Baal he is the first and principal king, not only because he's the biggest guy in the East, he's the first and principal king superior to the other kings. So if you can talk to Oriens, who's the superior, who sometimes gets close to actually being an alter ego of Baal, then you can work with all the others. Because the other three kings listen to what Baal or Oriens, whether they're the same character or not, and they listen to what the Eastern guy has to say. If you can work with the Eastern characters, you can work with all the others, to one extent or another. So this Eastern stuff, Baal, Oriens, Siraki, Skirlin, Lucifuge, Rothakali, etc., it's morphed versions of the same thing. You're working with the Eastern hierarchy in order to access the others. And that's why some grimoires get away with not even mentioning it. The spirits of the South, West and North, very much. They set you up with the Eastern stuff, and everything else can follow from there.
That is fascinating, Jake, and it brought to mind, the Heptameron circle clearly starts out with facing the east, and the naming principles as well. I know the aerial king in the Heptameron of Sunday is Varkon Rex, and as you touched on in the previous podcast, and I know others have touched on this, about the relationship between the seven kings of the 7 days and the jinn kings from the Arabic tradition. And, lo and behold, one of the jinn kings of the same day is not Varkon, but Burkan, the two thunders or two lightnings of, B and V do slip and slide a bit between languages. It's not uncommon. I mean, Vor can be pronounced Bor, for instance, and you get Balkan and Vulcan with that Hephaestus strain. So B and V very, very much interchangeable, and same character. Absolutely. And that kind of touches on something, Jake, in terms of, does the position or rank or overall position of the spirit, does the spirit's rank affect how you engage with the spirit, even though it might be the same spirit but in different grimoires? So here's an example for you. In the Heptameron, the king of Saturn is Maimon, obviously, but Maimon is not just a king of Saturday and Saturn. Maimon is also, in some manuscripts, depending on what you're looking at, one of the major kings of the 4 directions. So if you are engaging with Maimon, for example, does that deeply affect if you're addressing the spirit within a certain context as a king of a day versus a king of a direction, but it might be the same king? Can you comment on that, or how do you find that?
Yeah, that's something that's been on my mind a lot lately, and some of my recent Facebook posts are a result of those thoughts. There's operating parameters in the Grimoire Verum which share, to some extent, a dramatis persona you can find elsewhere. And some of those strands are compatible, and some of them, it's a bit difficult to unify them. And ultimately, you don't have to. I stick pretty much with the one grimoire in my work, the Grimoire Verum, and in my work, the spirits have particular roles. And we just discussed the differences between Welcome, Lansdowne, Grand Grimoire, and Grimoire Verum. Grimoire Verum seems to be a bit glitchy in this list of deputies, but I don't have to worry about it too much. As long as I'm consistent and coherent, the spirits will recognise, he's working such and such a manual, we will respond in such and such a way, and it remains open-ended, flexible, and powerful, regardless of the fact that I'm aware that their traditions might get some things more right than mine does, and or more wrong than mine does, but I've got a clear-cut set of parameters, a ritual language which I can use to engage with whatever is actually out there. They recognise it, I'm familiar and happy with it, so it can just roll. I can have a stack of other grimoires in my library, as I actually do, and find references to some of these spirits in completely different or rather different formulations. It doesn't worry me, because I've got my ritual structure, my ritual language. These are the parameters, this is the syntax. It's not trying to be an absolute truth, it's trying to be a useful bloody hand-on thing. And that's all I claim for it.
I think listeners will really find that valuable because it seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, that one of the points you just touched on was consistency. In other words, one might not be working with the Grimoire and Verum per se, but to use your example, no matter what it is, it's working it and working it and working it. And as you say, the spirits will recognize, you're working, the Key of Solomon, or you're working the Heptameron, or you're working the Hygromantia, or you're working the Grimoire and Verum. Is part of the magic, please pardon the pun, in the consistency of it, in doing it again and kind of establishing these patterns that might be recognized?
Yeah. The material, if you extend it or add to it or use it in a way that wasn't originally envisaged, that has to be appropriate to the original context in order to work well. And I've occasionally needed to branch off. I do occasionally work with, say, the Grand Grimoire, and there's strong similarities, but there's also a couple of differences. So I have to have a special formulation in order to do that little branch off and get my GV spirits to agree. Well, that's fine. We know I'm being someone different there a bit, and that's okay as long as you do it this agreed on branch off, more Grand Grimoire, less Grimoire and Verum style. You do have to negotiate if you need to branch off, which I don't very often, but if you do need to branch off, keeping it appropriate or not scotching the work you've already done, which is ongoing and creative and effective. Stick within the parameters as much as you can. Don't worry about the variants. Be aware of them. They can enrich things enormously. But there's nothing wrong with just sticking and being consistent within the one system. I don't find it stops me being ecumenical.
Absolutely. And to that point about just doing it, not to really worry about it, I asked Dr. Stephen Skinner about some people make a really big deal about properly pronouncing names and their original languages and whatnot. And, you have to be 100% correct on pronouncing something in a ritual. Can you just kind of comment on that, Jake, in terms of one wants to show fidelity to the original Hebraic or Greek names, but in terms of pronouncing everything, I said Adonai instead of Adonai or something like that. Can you just kind of comment on the importance, or is it overemphasized to have the pronunciations down completely? Can you comment on that?
Well, making an effort is, never to be sniffed at. But the Grimoire isn't necessarily perfect or complete. You're making your best effort, and the spirits can recognise what you're trying to do. He's a GV magician. Let's talk to him this way. Let's respond this way. So even if the Grimoire is incomplete, and there's no better example of bad Hebrew than the Grimoires, or bad Latin, come to that. So,
it's so true. In many regards. So we're back to the Austin spare neither thing. It's important, and no, it isn't. My Greek is virtually non-existent. I know that each vowel is pronounced, but they've got more vowels than we've got. I've tried various ways around this in the past, but I'm never going to be a linguist, and if it was indispensable, I wouldn't have much of a career. There's obviously a lot of interest around tracing the roots of things. You do that brilliantly in your writings, and a lot of people on forums online try to do that with the Heptameron and the Sworn Book of Honorius. And in a forum recently, Jake, you made a comment about the lunar theology of Honorius, so to speak, versus the Heptameron, where you said, quote, "We may think that we see planetary spirits in the Heptameron, but closer examination reveals it to concern the aerial spirits classified in planetary terms. The Honorius model takes this much, much further, discarding the conventional planetary models entirely and placing the moon at the top. This lunar theology involves and accesses a whole different world," unquote. I found that quote fascinating. I was like, I wish I could get Jake on the podcast to talk about this. And what are your thoughts on that, Jake? Can you expand upon the lunar theology and how it accesses an entirely different world?
Well, we simply write the planetary glyphs in the order they're given in the list of spirits of the days in Honorius. If you just list them vertically, the moon is at the top and the sun is at the bottom. And you can relate this quite readily to Plutarch and other author's description of the sublunar sphere. You've got the moon at the top, and then you've got the spirits of the aerial spirits of the four directions, and then you've got the terrestrial spirits, and finally, sun at the bottom is in the underworld. That's a map. Yeah, that is a map of the sublunar worlds that matches exactly late classical Neoplatonism, like Plutarch. And yeah, it's very common to find things attributed to the planets, to tell you what kind of energy they have. But the planets weren't the original model for a start. So these are merely useful handles. Yeah, the days of the week are attributed to the planets, but as numerous people have remarked about planetary days and hours, they have no obvious relationship to the movement of those planets. But what they might well have relationships with is the rising of the decans, which are fixed stars. I think originally the planetary hours were the gods of the hours, and the decans were the model, not the planets. And then the decans become attributed to the planets, and somehow or another we morph into having planetary hours, but they're really connected much more with the ascendant, and whatever's rising at dawn will be the decan of the day. And so, as we all know, the first hour of the day is the one that's usually recommended. So you are in, whether you know how Fortuna is calculated or not, if you operate at dawn, Fortuna will be conjunct in the way it's meant to be. You will have some of the good features of a good astrological chart for your occasion without even being aware what those principles are. And that's why the first hour of the day is so emphasized. Yeah, it's the decan rising, and Fortuna will automatically be doing its thing at that time.
Even if your knowledge of astrology or electional astrology is limited, you really can't go wrong if you're working with a spirit on the day and hour, especially the first hour of that day. That's a pretty potent time to get.
But it's more likely related to the decans than it is to the actual planets. And the same thing is going on in attributing various levels of the sublunar sphere to the planets. When you go back into more primitive times, they may not even have been aware of that the planets existed, but they were perfectly well aware of the four directions, and of the Earth, and of the Moon, and they had an idea of the underworld, so their set of seven was just waiting for some astrologically inclined person to come and peg the planets onto later. But there's lots of sets of seven that don't necessarily relate to the planet.
That kind of touches on something that you've commented on in the past, Jake, that, quote, the most important words in occultism are I don't know. They're magic words because saying them enables you to do something about it. It's also much easier to say them if you don't take yourself too seriously, end quote. So can you share your thoughts with our listeners on this, Jake, in terms of why these words, I don't know, are so important in not only occultism, but also just ceremonial magic in general?
Well, yeah, I keep getting this Austin's Fair vibe at the moment. Does not matter, need not be. It doesn't matter that you don't know, as long as you're doing something, and you may well find some of what you don't know answers itself as a result of just following the instructions, so to speak. Saying I'm not going to do any magic until I understand everything that's involved means you will never do magic. It's as simple as that. You might have ridiculous reasons for starting your career as a magician. It doesn't matter, because whatever your reasons are, they're probably not the real reason. And you will find better explanations for why you got into it in the first place a bit further down the track. So, if you want to go into magic to fly on a broomstick or whatever it is initially, it doesn't really matter as long as you actually do some magic. And you become disabused of your illusions, hopefully, as you go along. And there's plenty of things I don't know. Plenty of languages I can't read, plenty of manuscripts I've never looked at. And keeping it simple, has its virtues. I know I can trust this manual as long as I'm not too hook, line and sinker and expect the spirits to always be good and always be honest. And I've got my operating procedure one I'm very comfortable with because I've worked it for a long time. I'm aware of various others, and I have indeed worked various others, but the actual work produces the answers. Your objections get overridden if you persist long enough.
Yes, and I'm noticing to that point, Jake, a very well thought out, intentional acquiescence among high-level authors and magicians such as yourself and Dr. Stephen Skinner. For example, you mentioned there's languages that you're never going to get around to know, that keeping it simple is key. Dr. Skinner mentioned, I think we were talking about the Faustian grimoires, and he's like, look, I'm never going to get around to German. There are English translations of this that's good enough for me. And so just to kind of follow up with that, Jake, can you talk about the need to be selective, to resist the temptation of, oh my gosh, I have to be a jack of all trades. I have to know a little bit about Wicca and a little bit about ceremonial magic and a little bit about paganism and a little bit about Celtic mythology. And can you just talk about that? Because I'm noticing that for you and other high-level authors, so to speak, that there is this kind of selectiveness and simplicity that is very useful. Yeah.
I mean, I kind of divide the material I draw on into two main stacks, and one is quite a small stack. It's the stuff I'm actually working with directly, and then there's this huge teetering stack of everything else I've ever been interested in, some of which bears directly and some of which is tangential, which I'm aware of. I don't believe either stack contains the absolute truth, but having the simple, this is my manual, I'm just going to get on with it stack, clearly distinguished from everything else, without writing everything else off, is kind of important, and also pretty bloody hard to express, to be fair. But yeah, it's simple on the one side, but obviously complex on the other. Stephen Skinner is a very, very accomplished man. When he says to keep it simple, he's obviously talking to a particular area of your actual practice. There's lots of things you can know about and other things you will never know enough about, and they're all in this other stack. Don't be blind to it, but don't be weighed down by it either.
That, Jake, goes to a point. This is more of a practical question, but I spoke with Dr. Skinner about this, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. We all know the importance of the initial consecration, the charging, so to speak, of magical implements in the grimoire context. However, Jake, can you talk about the concept of possibly reconsecrating or recharging of magical implements? Is this even needed from time to time for a magician who's practicing consistently, or is it basically once a consecrated sword, always a consecrated sword? Can you kind of touch on that, especially someone like you, because you take great pains to not only, show fidelity to the original sources, but I remember in the last podcast you even mentioned, I don't, take pictures of my implements and put them up on the internet. I want to keep things very close to the vest, very, very private, because those are ritual implements. So can you touch on this whole concept about consecrating items and possibly reconsecrating items?
Reconsecration, absolutely no problem. I do. So the answer is yes. For example, this sojourn in New York State, I had to transport some of my instruments across the Atlantic. Some of them may even have been examined by customs officials, who knows, just the same as I have done on other major occasions. Everything goes, all the instruments go on the altar, and the GV has an horizon of the instruments. It's used for the knife specifically, but it's also very specific that it can be used for all the instruments upon the altar. And yeah, I redo that before I settle down to doing whatever I'm getting together to do. And it's not a difficult process. It's very interesting sub-ritual of the process. It's got an analogue in the PGM. There's the consecration for all occasions, which is a very adaptable process. And it talks about how you can use this for consecrating images or talismans or phylacteries and so on. So it's a very general form for consecration and has some strong textual resemblances to the process in the GV. I'm not saying they're directly, one's directly derived from the other, but they have strong affinities. But yeah, absolutely, reconsecrate. It's not an unduly arduous process, and I'd say it's probably a given. And the fact that there is a consecration for all the instruments on the altar in the GV is interesting, because there are also specific consecrations for all of those instruments. So it is assuming when you made that instrument, you purified, consecrated it, but also before you set out on this next stage, all of them go on the altar together and they're consecrated again.
As you were sharing that, I had a vision of a customs official opening a bag and finding a register of spirits and a consecrated sword and a phylactery and just wondering what might be going through the custom official's head at that time.
Or a badger's penis bone, yeah. Hypothetically.
It's touche. Well said, sir. That kind of goes to the depth and breadth of your knowledge when it comes to ceremonial magic, and also things that wouldn't be necessarily classified as, high-level ceremonial magic, which would be Cunningman's magic. And obviously, we were hearing that Dr. Stephen Skinner has a Cunningman's Grimoire that's coming out. I'm hoping to talk to him down the road about the Cunningman's Grimoire. But for the listeners out there, Jake, I'd love to get your take on quote-unquote Cunningman's magic in general, especially if they're not too familiar, Jake. Can you just kind of talk about what is Cunningman's magic or Cunningman's magical procedures as you see it, and how is that different from John Dee and Kelly in Ivory Tower somewhere talking to angels? Can you just kind of delineate that and share the importance of Cunningman's magic?
Well, Cunningman, as Skinner's book's likely to exemplify, weren't immune to the attractions of Solomonic magic, but they were certainly on a different part of the spectrum nonetheless. And the cunning thing, you find it in different forms. I mean, down in Cornwall they talk about pillars, but there's this character in Dorset called Conjuring Minton, and that, conjuring, maybe with an apostrophe rather than a G, seems to have been another way of referring to a very similar kind of character, Conjuring Minton, Conjuring Jack. And he is spoken of disparagingly by some more aristocratic or posh learned magicians of his time. Same token, he's really big in the folklore of Dorset and connects with other folklore streams. I mean, there's talk about him jumping off a hill on a demonic steed and knocking one of the pinnacles off of Backham Church, and in which he was originally buried half in and half out of the church so as to get around the conditions of a pact. And this diabolical horse also turns up in local folklore without an attendant magician, so he's kind of somehow tapped into something, possibly going back to the cult of Woden in the area. Yeah, so they're important figures, and I talk about this in an essay called The Other Magicians, which refers to certain comments Reginald Scott makes about magicians and the more learned kind of conjurer. As we'll know about magical circles and so on. And so magicians are the one, the highbrow guys perhaps, and then there's the more learned kind of conjurer, a cunning man who's got more books and can actually read. He's another kind of magician. The other kind of magician is, it's quite a theme in my work and my interests, and I have more affinities and sympathies with the more learned kind of conjurer than I do with the magicians. With T, incidentally. Magicians is how it's spelled in the original. That period of English is a bit inconsistent, but one of its charms.
So Cunningman's magic is, as you say, it's the more learned kind of conjurer, someone who has more books. Does the Cunningman's magical engagements also speak to the fact that a lot of the things mentioned in the grimoires, a lion skin belt, for example, and certain other things, were pretty hard to come by? Is there more of an accessibility when it comes to materials in Cunningman's magical engagements, or is that just a popular misconception?
I think it's unlikely they possessed all of the supposedly indispensable trappings of the megaton. Yeah, they were obviously working a form of magic, and it was merely informed and elaborated via what we think of as the learned guys. This isn't just in England either. There's witch trial records in Spain, which talk about finding pots of earth from a grave and dirt swept from the 7 prisons of Madrid. They're obviously talking about a different kind of practitioner from what we think of as the typical Solomonic high magic. But at the same time, they had grimoires, which were prized possessions and also prized props, but not just to impress the punters any more than the dirt swept from the prisons was. They were obviously there for practical reasons. And you can't say that one is authentic and one isn't. All you can say is one is more literary and one is a bit more sort of grassroots. The cunning man can only be a cunning man if he's working for a community, for a public. Whereas an angel magician may just be working for himself, improving his lot or seeking spiritual goals or whatever. But it's interesting, some of the goals the grimoires seek aren't exactly typical of well-heeled aristocrats. Why on earth would you need spells for X, Y, Z when you've got a mansion and a steady income coming directly from the crown? Not automatically considered for an officership in the armed forces and so on. Well-heeled magicians don't generally need half of the spells that appear in the grimoires. They've already got a comfortable lifestyle. I don't think Solomonic magic belongs to one social class at all. I mean, it has quite a lot of variety. It's been around for quite a long time. It may have been the property of quite poverty-stricken lower clerics at one point in its trajectory, as well as later on the manuscripts were collected by rich aristocrats who for some reason would begun to associate with the genre itself, when plainly they have no need of half the things the grimoires are meant to supply. Things are a lot more complicated than assumed.
Absolutely. And to that point about maybe making things more complicated than they seem, I'd love to ask you about something that I know you've written about and Dr. Skinner's mentioned when it comes to preparing for a ritual and ritual purifications. One thinks of the 9-day Solomonic purification, but something Dr. Skinner touches on in techniques of Solomonic magic is, for instance, doing a ritual bath before an operation. According to Dr. Skinner, it's, these things have no spiritual value at all. By washing your body, you're not purifying your soul. You're doing it because the spirits have an acute sense of smell, and the smell of human kind of smells are a really big turnoff for them, and it might put them off. And that a lot of these purifications in the Hygromantia and in the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri are much more practical than they are spiritual. Jake, can you talk about that? Do you find that to be the case in your own experience about the kind of interesting physicality of magic, or are there some spiritual components that you've noticed to ritual purification?
Not necessarily either or. As a few points in this conversation, there are great Neoplatonist teachers and authorities who performed Orphic purifications and God knows what, which were definitely meant to give them a privileged place, perhaps in the afterlife, for instance. Referring back to whether spirits are stupid or not, Egyptian priests used to shave all the hair off their body in order to invoke gods. So maybe the gods have also got a strong sense of smell. But at the same time, you're invoking gods. I mean, that is the process of theology in later times. So it's hard to totally separate mundane needs supplied by spirits and your possible spiritual evolution. And if you're going to have the authority to conjure spirits, well, being a holy person or being able to pass the one temporarily might well be a good way of having that authority. So it's not just to please the spirits, although it is to please the spirits. It's not just to be a more spiritual person, although magic should play a role in your spiritual evolution, and I think it does. Sometimes the spirits have a bad press, they will lead you into temptation and all the rest of it. But you have a choice of being misled. And this could conceivably be a test, and you can pass or fail. And if you pass, perhaps the spirits are actually nudging you towards greater spirituality, even though they may, from another perspective, they may seem quite different. The magician and the spirit are equally parts of the process. And you can't say that everything relates just to how to pull one over on the spirits.
Jake, that goes to another question that I've spoken with Aaron Leach about this when he talked about his own evolution of spirits from when he first wrote Secrets of the Magical Grimoires and seeing things in kind of more of a binary, bipolar fashion, like there's, a chthonic entity and an angelic entity. And now he's kind of evolved saying, an entity like Michael, for example, can have, attributes and powers and engagements that might seem, on one side of the spectrum versus on the other side of the spectrum, and that, Ishtar and Astarte and, and Astaroth are not too far apart. So I guess the question, Jake, would be, in your own deep experience, when it comes to engaging in spiritual entities, do you find that there really isn't that hard of a line between a chthonic entity and an aerial entity and a celestial entity, quote unquote, and that these things are more on a spectrum depending on the on the ritual, or is there more of a hard line that you see?
No, I don't see any hard line particularly, although the assumptions that come with a particular set of parameters can be misleading, or at least don't match your preferences and those of the spirits quite so well. But you can trace a chthonic deity in back of Michael the Archangel, who's arguably celestial or solar or mercurial, depending which source you follow. And the operating parameters I have, there is a role for angels, but it's not the role of thwarting angels. You examine the names of some of the angels I invoke on a regular basis as part of the procedure. You find that they're fallen angels. It looks more like chain of command than celestial versus chthonic. It's a very nuanced subject, and one man's set of operating parameters may involve assumptions that aren't present in another, and being able to compare them while putting certain assumptions aside, saying this is relevant to mine but maybe not to yours, is kind of bloody difficult. I'm not saying it shouldn't be tried, but it is kind of difficult. When I say I don't do angels, I'm joking about my attitude to thwarting angels rather than dismissing the role of angels altogether.
Jake, is this kind of Catholic-heavy grimoire language, this kind of command and control, even though it's present earlier in history, was that really amplified in Europe in the Middle Ages and onward? And do you find that the earlier back you go, there tends to be more of a relationship, or is it more of a fluid line? How do you see that evolution between those two approaches happening?
Well, an implied ability to compel can certainly be found in the PGM, and sometimes it's more overt and sometimes it's more covert. You are assumed to be a pretty tough dude who could compel if it was required, and sometimes you say that you have that ability as a matter of course, while also being quite ready to welcome the spirit and be polite should that prove feasible and the most straightforward response. But yeah, I think the compulsion thing gets a different emphasis, a stronger emphasis under Catholicism, under that historical strand of Catholicism that concerns the grimoires. And there is a gap now in that the magical revival to a large extent involves people from Protestant or secularized Protestant culture. Obviously, characters like Madame Blavatsky or others, you could say, well, they were Georgian, or so-and-so was actually Catholic. Yeah, but they were talking to thousands of people who weren't. And so we can see the grimoires have this Catholic emphasis, and the New World traditions often have a Catholic element, distinguish it from Orthodox Catholicism by using folk Catholic, but it is there. But that isn't accessible to most of us in the Western occult revival. There are very articulate persons who are Catholic and can explain it to us, but we don't have that background, we don't have that culture. We have to find other strategies to provide whatever we are missing that it was providing to those other people. I hope that makes some kind of sense. I'm certainly not being anti-Catholic here. I'm just saying a whole lot of us don't have access, don't have that cultural background. It's not instinctive to us. So we have to find other strategies, and you need to be pretty bloody clear about what it was providing in order to even begin to evolve such a strategy. But I don't think it's impossible.
Oh, absolutely, Jake. And does that also follow your point about spirits tend to recognize a certain method or a certain approach? So to your point, even if someone does not have all of the Catholic training and background, by finding those other alternatives, a spirit recognizes the attempt at what is being made. Would that be somewhat fair?
Yeah, something along those lines is what I'm implying, yes. Yeah, I think it's different strokes for different folks. It's very much an issue for this Protestant influenced, Protestant cultural occult revival that we have. I'm not saying that Protestantism is homogenous across the board or anything of that kind. I'm just saying, we don't have that background. We have to take steps to provide whatever it was supplying elsewhere. And it's absolutely doable. And I'm considering writing about it in this book that's not appearing at the moment. But it's a difficult subject to engage with because people have so many preconceptions and are likely to overreact to any suggestion that we do things differently or that we, in the current period, we necessarily have to do something differently. The spirits certainly recognise what you're trying to do, but sometimes you have to step up the game in line with cultural and historical trends that can't just be ignored. We can't pretend that we're medieval clerics or whatever. That's inadequate.
A question, Jake, that you touched on in the previous podcast was advice to magicians. And one of the biggest things that you said is just do it, just jump in. Do you have any other advice that you would recommend to people who are interested in approaching the work as you do, especially by tracing the deep goetic roots? Any other pitfalls, or are there any other things that you would recommend that people follow through on?
Well, generally, you have to make your own mistakes. And you might get a whole lot of beginner's luck, or you might burn your fingers quite early on. I mean, there are stories about prominent occultists of yesteryear who once invoked a demon and it all went horribly wrong and they shut down the temple straight away. And you're like, what? He wasn't encouraged by this experience and just, maybe adjusted his operating procedure for another try. You will get your fingers burnt sooner or later, and it will be a learning curve, hopefully. Nobody said that it was going to be an automatic pass. An ordeal that can't be failed isn't an ordeal. Initiation by ordeal is quite a common theme. The spirits will test you. You need nerve. You certainly need nerve, and go back and do it again, even when something off-putting or nothing at all should happen in consequence of your first effort. It's very hard to explain everything before you start. You can't expect to have all the answers before you start. We are recovering magic rather than heirs to a continuous tradition that's available on every street corner. Talk about a fairly simple ritual, familiar to lots of people. That's a ritual of the pentagram. But you could write a multi-volume thesis on the Kabbalistic symbolism and its implications, and on the magical gestures that are used, and the directions and everything. And yet the ritual itself, you could probably do in about 5 minutes. Your first efforts are going to be possibly fumbling and won't be taking into account everything that conceivably could be involved in it. But the ritual itself isn't that difficult to go through the motions and start familiarizing yourself with it and becoming second nature. And then all this other stuff, it makes a great deal more sense anyway.
I always point people to the advice that you gave the first time you were on the podcast, which is, just do it. I mean, just jump in and don't look back. And can you talk about this, Jake? Because Frater Ashen Chassan mentions this too, about pushing through failure. I mean, some people might say, well, gosh, I spent 9 days purifying. I have the lion skin belt. I acquired it on the black market. I did everything. I have all the preparations. I've done every single step. I purified for 9 days. I memorized all the evocations, and it failed. I didn't get anything out of it. I didn't feel any presence. There was nothing there. What do I do? Is this whole thing just, crazy? What's going on? Can you talk about the importance of, as you just touched on, pushing through perhaps early failures or early setbacks and why that's so important?
Well, it just seems to come with the territory to a large extent. But if you're a ritual magician, you should definitely be performing rituals and repeating them until they're second nature. Because that's part of the job description. Is that you're good at this stuff. So, you have to keep doing it until you are improving and adjust things later on. When it comes to lion skin belts and triangles and so on, again, this isn't my preferred modus operandi, and perhaps that's a useful alternative. Don't try the mainstream book, which millions of people have read and have all got radically different, contradictory opinions about. Choose one that's less commonly used, shut up about it, and just do it quietly yourself. And the Grimoire Verum is my chosen grimoire, partly because it isn't the Goetia of Solomon. The Goetia of Solomon has many things I really like. The Spirit Catalogue, for a start, I've always responded well to it, but eventually the various problems with the text led me to just try something else and stick with that. I assumed, and my assumption has been borne out, that doing this simple cut down process, which is actually pretty damn complete compared to the Grimoire of Solomon, which has omissions and problems, would eventually throw light on the Grimoire of Solomon as well. Whatever this territory is, implicit in the Grimoire of Solomon, is also accessible via the Grimoire and Verum, which is much more, although simpler in a lot of ways, is much more complete. The process is all there. All the parts are identifiable. You know why each instrument is mentioned because it gives you instructions on how to use them and when. There's nothing superfluous there. It may not be perfect, but it's all there. And that threw light on the wider subject of Grimoire. The manual you're working with is hugely popular and the subject of major debates on the internet every day. That might be giving you problems. Try another one.
Is there anything, Jake, you can share with us in terms of, I think people would be really interested to know, what is your next project? What is your next book? What are some of the things that listeners can look forward to? Anything, well, you always have irons in the fire, but is there any of the irons that you can take out of the fire to share with us or, kind of give us a preview on?
I'm thinking a lot about occult primers. I have been for a while, and I'm trying to write something along those lines. I've come to the conclusion that primer is a deliberate subterfuge. Nobody's ever written one. They all throw you, maybe not at the deep end, but considerably far along from the shallow end. Hewson's book is a master example. It includes lots of instructions on making your instruments, performing rituals, but there's also a lot of herbal and aromatic instruction there, and most of the best primers share those features. A balance of ritualistic stuff, whether it's verbal or your consecrations of the instruments, and this more nitty-gritty stuff of working with leaves and dirts and so on. That balance you can find in a whole bunch of the primers, Conway's, for instance, and books related to the primers like Cavendish's Black Arts. So, this is what I'm thinking about, is writing a primer that is 21st century. You go back to this stuff in the 70s and so on, things have moved on. There are things in our awareness now where there's much higher awareness of the African traditional religions, and the papyri have been published since all of those books were written. So we have access to more stimulating material and source material than ever before, and some of the primers aren't quite up to the job. They're still very good, some of them, but you have to make your own synthesis out of them in anticipation of whatever the next primer would be like, because it ain't there. And that's what I'm working on slowly at the moment. I'm not compelled to write every day like I was with the Encyclopedia Galactica. I'm taking it slowly and responding to stimuli in the outside world. Well, you mentioned Faust earlier, the German Faust stuff. Well, I'm getting a whole lot of attraction to the Czech Faust, which is even more erudite and out there and unacknowledged. Whether that's of interest to all my readers or not, it's of interest to me. So that may or may not form part of the book. But don't hold your breath, because I am not flat out on this project. I'm kind of rolling with it.
Absolutely. Well, I think listeners will really keep their ear to the ground to get updates on that. I think they'd be very interested. And that leads to one last question, Jake, which is, Dr. Skinner mentioned on the podcast, too, that, he's been toying with the idea of writing and releasing and publishing a book on actual practical steps on how to conduct ceremonial magic. But he mentions he's kind of torn on that in terms of, on the one hand, he thinks it'd be good to get the word out about how to actually do these things properly. But on the other hand, he mentioned that, there are some people, and I'm paraphrasing here, but just some people who might misuse this and not use it responsibly. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of, as Dr. Skinner goes through his own debate on that? And have you ever felt in your writings or with stuff that you're, as you just mentioned, currently working on or may work on in the future about that kind of tension between, I want to publish this and get this out for the benefit of people versus the dark fluff crowd or people who are not responsible might misuse that? Any thoughts on that?
Well, hopefully somewhere further down the line, I hear younger folks are currently a little confused, as I was myself when I set out. We'll absorb more and separate the chaff from the weeds, and a few years down the line they'll be the new generation of old hands. And not dismissive of people who haven't necessarily got all the background down pat straight away. You never will have all of it. But I can certainly understand a certain reluctance to publish, not being compelled to get it finished overnight. I can relate to that from what I'm working on at the moment. And I do occasionally regret writing a single word, depending what the feedback's like on that day. But at the same time, acceptable parameters. Some people will misuse it, some people won't use it at all, but it's magic I care about at the end of the day. Yeah, I kind of accept that there will be problems and issues, and some people will fail, and some people won't, and some people won't do anything at all. And meanwhile, magic is my first love. I mean, I've dedicated most of my life to it, and a lot of other things have taken second place. So, yeah, I'm not going to quit yet.
Jake, I do not see you quitting for a long, long time. That is for darn sure. Well, Jake Stratton-Kent, we really appreciate you taking the time. Before you go, I just wanted to make sure that people know where to find you. Obviously, we have the your Facebook page, the attendance of Adrastia. Where else would you like them to check out? Any websites or any ways to follow your own writings and whatnot?
Well, Scarlet Imprint keep Encyclopedia Goetica available indefinitely in paperback. It's an unlimited edition, so our poorer students are well provided for there. You can have this in paperback, put it in your rucksack and go down the Amazon or hitchhiking around Europe, whatever you want to do. Attendance is available, and I'm fairly readily findable online. You can a bit of Google foo, you can probably find out my email address and hassle me there. Yeah, I try to be Mr. Accessible as much as possible.
I just cannot thank you enough for taking the time and stopping by the podcast today. Thank you.
All right, it's been a pleasure.
And thank you for listening to this episode of the Glitch Bottle Podcast and helping us uncork the uncommon this fine day or night or wherever you happen to occupy space-time in your occult lairs, your summoning towers, or your cloistered libraries of the esoterically awesome. You can check out previous episodes and other magical Glitch Bottle news on YouTube, youtube.com/glitchbottle, and subscribe and download free episodes anytime on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and on Spreaker.com. Just search Glitch Bottle and enjoy. Also, please make sure to subscribe and follow us on Twitter at Glitch Bottle, all one word. Our intro music is the track Tornado by David Zeste. Our magical interest is fueled by sincerity, passion, amazing guests, and a copious amount of clinking coffee cups. Until next time, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.